What if everything we call history is merely the faint echo after the real story ended? Imagine for a moment that the beginning of civilization wasn't the spark of fire in a hunter-esque cave, but the dying breath of a forgotten empire. Before the flood, before the pyramids, before even the first name etched into clay, there was an age when 8 kings ruled the earth for 241,200 years. Not a myth, not a metaphor, but a record carved in the oldest writing ever found. And the question that has haunted scholars, priests, and dreamers ever since is this: how can something impossible be written as fact? To entertain that thought is to walk on the knife's edge between history and heresy. You are told human civilization began roughly 6,000 years ago, with farming, writing, and kingship emerging slowly in Mesopotamia. But what if that neat, comforting timeline is only the final page of a much longer book? A book torn in half, its first chapters drowned beneath mud and myth. The Sumerian king list doesn't whisper. It declares with the blunt precision of an accountant that before the Great Flood, 8 monarchs ruled from cities that should not yet have existed. Each reigned for tens of thousands of years. Then, one sentence ends it all. Then the flood swept over. If the line between legend and chronicle is drawn by evidence, then this small clay prism sitting in a museum forces us to redraw it. A single artifact, no larger than your hand, dares to say that human order began not from within the earth, but from above it. It records the arrival of kingship as something descended from heaven. That phrase, repeated like a mantra across tablets, has the quiet authority of a transmission rather than a metaphor. To the Sumerians, this wasn't symbolic poetry. It was a statement of receipt. The right to rule was delivered. How does one even begin to process a claim like that? We have been taught to think of progress as a staircase: stone tools, bronze, iron, silicon. But perhaps what we call progress is the rebuilding of something lost. If the king list is a memory rather than a myth, then the flood was not the birth of civilization, but its amnesia. Imagine a world erased so thoroughly that its survivors had to rediscover their own language, their own mathematics, their own gods. A reset so complete that what came after could mistake itself for the beginning. In the soft dust of Iraq, archaeologists once brushed the surface of a prism inscribed with wedge-shaped letters, cuneiform, the script of the Sumerians. As the sun rose over the desert, the lines glowed like the ribs of a fossilized creature from another epoch. The writing spoke of Eridu, Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, 5 cities of the gods. It named kings who ruled longer than mountains endure. Yet there was no poetry here, no hymns, no divine moral lessons. Just data, names, reigns, totals. It reads less like scripture and more like a ledger. And that's what makes it terrifying. Because if someone invents a legend, they fill it with emotion, miracles, betrayal, redemption. But the king list is cold, mechanical. It doesn't try to persuade, it records. A voice from before history, speaking in the language of numbers. And that voice seems to say, this happened. To deny it is easy. To ignore it is impossible. Each generation of scholars reinterprets the same lines. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. They call it symbolic. Perhaps heaven meant divine right, or perhaps heaven was just the Sumerian word for authority. Yet the more they analyze, the more the words resist being reduced. Eridu is real. Its ruins still lie under the sands of southern Iraq. It was one of the first cities humanity ever built, or rebuilt. So we stand before a paradox wrapped in clay. Either the Sumerians were the most disciplined fantasists in history, or they were remembering something we have forgotten. A civilization that predates the flood myths of every continent, a lineage of rulers whose reigns outlasted ice ages. The prism does not shout this truth. It hums it quietly, like an old engine still running beneath the soil. You can almost hear it if you listen closely. The echo of a forgotten administration, a governance so vast it required time measured not in years, but in celestial cycles. What if 240 years isn't an exaggeration, but a code, a calendar written for minds that counted differently? The number corresponds neatly with the Sumerian base 60 system, 8 kings, their reigns totaling 67 sars, 3,600 years per unit. To them, mathematics wasn't invention, it was revelation. Numbers were divine architecture. Somewhere between those numbers and the flood that erased them, we lost something crucial, the conviction that our world is older, stranger, and more deliberate than we dare to admit. Perhaps the question is not whether those kings existed, but why their memory was meant to survive. Why did ancient scribes labor to copy the same list onto tablets scattered across Mesopotamia, from Nippur to Kish to Ur, each repeating the same impossible durations? They were not writing fiction. They were preserving continuity, a lineage reaching into an age when gods and rulers were indistinguishable. Tonight, as the desert wind crosses the ruins of Eridu, the ground beneath still holds their names. The stars above still move in patterns the Sumerians charted with unerring precision. And somewhere in between earth and heaven, lies that unspoken premise that kingship was installed, not invented. So before we go further, suspend disbelief. Set aside what school books insist, and let the question breathe. What if the king list isn't myth, but memory? What if the flood didn't erase our past, but encrypted it? The answer may not lie in the heavens, nor in the earth, but in the uneasy space between them. The space where history becomes mythology, and mythology becomes truth. Under the blazing sun of 1922, a small group of British archaeologists sifted through the dust of southern Iraq. They were excavating the ruins of ancient Larsa, unaware that their trowels were about to disturb not just soil, but chronology itself. Among the broken bricks and temple shards, they found a four-sided prism of baked clay, no larger than a man's hand, covered top to bottom in cuneiform script. It looked ordinary, until the scholars began to read. What they discovered wasn't a prayer, or a harvest record, or an ode to the gods. It was a list of kings who ruled the earth before the flood. The welled Blundell prism, as it came to be known, was soon carried to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. There, under controlled light and glass, it would quietly contradict 5,000 years of accepted history. When experts translated the lines, they expected a mundane chronology of city-state rulers. Instead, they found reigns so immense that logic recoiled. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. His successor, Alalgar, 36,000. The pattern continued across 8 kings, 5 cities, and a total of 241,200 years. Then, without warning, the narrative ended with 4 words. Then the flood swept over. The prism's tone is chillingly bureaucratic. It is not poetic, not allegorical. It reads like an inventory, as though the scribe were tallying shipments, not dynasties. And yet what it records is impossible. Historians, confronted with these numbers, called them mythic exaggerations. They said the early kings were gods in symbolic disguise, their reigns a metaphor for celestial cycles. But the document itself refuses to wink. It offers no cues that it is playing pretend. It describes a world with the same matter-of-fact clarity as our census lists today. Imagine the hand that etched those lines. A priest scribe, kneeling beside a clay tablet still damp from the river, pressing wedge marks in careful sequence. He wasn't inventing legends. He was archiving. To him, these kings were not abstractions, but ancestors. Each figure, each number, preserved with reverence and precision. The text even follows Sumer's sexagesimal system, the base 60 mathematics still used to divide our hours and circles. To the Sumerians, 3,600 years formed a sacred unit, 1 sar. The reigns of the 8 kings form a symmetrical pattern of sars, 8, 10, 12, neatly structured, deliberately balanced. That symmetry is not the handprint of a storyteller. It is the signature of a civilization obsessed with cosmic order. Modern readers approach the prism as a relic of superstition, but its creators likely saw it as a record of physics and governance, not faith. In their worldview, time was cyclical, vast, and measured in the rhythms of stars. If a being descended from heaven, whatever heaven meant, it might live not by solar years, but by some other measure entirely. 1,000 of our years could be a single breath to them. The numbers on the prism might not be exaggerations. They might be translations, celestial durations converted, imperfectly, into human arithmetic. Still, the shock lies not only in the scale of time, but in the transition that follows. After the line about the flood, the list resumes. New kings arise in new cities, Kish, Uruk, Ur, but their reigns shrink dramatically. Hundreds of years become dozens. Gods give way to men. The same scribe who recorded lifespans of 36,000 years now writes calmly of reigns lasting 126. The handwriting doesn't change. The tone doesn't change. Only the math does. The document treats both epochs, the impossible and the plausible, as a continuous history separated by water. This is what scholars call the paradox of the prism. If the later kings are historically verifiable, Gilgamesh of Uruk among them, how can the same document's earlier entries be dismissed as myth? The prism refuses to split itself. It offers one unbroken timeline, demanding that we either accept all of it or reject the entire thing. For a historian, that is intolerable. For a storyteller, it is irresistible. The mystery deepens when we remember that this prism is not unique. Fragments of the same king list have been found across Mesopotamia, in Nippur, Susa, Ur, and Kish, each consistent, each repeating the same reigns and the same final sentence. Then the flood swept over. 16 copies of the same cosmic script, dispersed yet identical, suggest an origin story too foundational to fabricate. To the Sumerians, the flood wasn't mythic punishment. It was a timestamp, a boundary between two operating systems of existence, one divine, one mortal. In the museum's low light, the prism gleams softly, its clay a dull gold. Thousands of visitors pass by, without knowing they are looking at a document that erases the line between myth and archaeology. The curator's plaque speaks of an early example of historiography. But the word history seems almost arrogant in the face of what it contains. The prism is older than history. It is the instruction manual for history itself. To touch its surface, if one were allowed, would be to place your hand on the fossil of time. You might feel the indentation of symbols carved by someone who believed they were recording the truth of creation. The prism speaks, not in the language of miracles, but of record-keeping. And that makes its message harder to ignore. Perhaps that's why, a century later, we still circle back to its question: who were those 8 kings? Are their names merely placeholders for eras, or are they echoes of real beings who ruled when the world was young and strange? The clay doesn't answer. It just waits, silent as stone, daring us to listen closely enough to hear what the earth itself remembers. There is a line carved into that prism that changes everything. It stands at the top of the text, almost unassuming, yet it carries the weight of a command. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. 8 words in translation, and the entire story of civilization rearranges itself around them. Kingship descended. It didn't evolve. It didn't emerge. It arrived. To most historians, the phrase is symbolic, a poetic way of saying that authority was divine. But the Sumerians were literal thinkers disguised as mystics. Their world was not divided between the sacred and the scientific. The two were one fabric. Heaven was not a metaphor for moral authority. It was a coordinate, a place. The descent of kingship, then, reads less like theology and more like a transaction, an installation. A system of order dropped into chaos. Imagine what this means. That the structure of rule, hierarchy, law, the very concept of a throne, was not a human invention, but a package delivered from an external source. Civilization, in this light, was not a homegrown garden, but a transplanted seed. And Eridu, the city named in that line, becomes not just humanity's first capital, but the landing site of something far greater. Archaeology confirms that Eridu is ancient beyond reason. Beneath its ruins, layers of temples stack one atop another, 17 in all, built directly on the same sacred spot, century after century. Each reconstruction grander than the last, as if every generation was desperate to keep a connection open with whatever had first touched that ground. At the deepest level, archaeologists found a small shrine surrounded by offerings of fish bones, an altar dedicated to Enki, the god of water, knowledge, and creation. Enki was called the Lord who came from the Abzu, the abyss beneath the world's waters. To the Sumerians, he was not a mythic figure but a scientist, a maker. In his city, Eridu, kingship was said to have descended. The pattern fits too neatly to ignore. In Sumerian iconography, gods are depicted not as clouds or spirits, but as tangible beings, robed, crowned, human-shaped but grander in proportion. Their word for god, Dingir, also meant shining one. The connection to light, to descent, to movement between heaven and earth, saturates their art. On cylinder seals, you can see winged figures descending stairways, holding tools, standing before star symbols that some have compared to rockets, though the scholars blanch at the suggestion. But consider this. Why would an early agrarian people imagine rulers descending from the sky? Why not from the mountains, or the sea, or the forests they knew? The direction they chose implies memory, not imagination. Something in their collective story remembered power coming from above. And once you strip the centuries of theology away, what remains feels disturbingly specific. Across cultures, the same pattern echoes. In Egypt, pharaohs ruled as the sons of Ra, their legitimacy descending with the morning sun. In China, emperors governed by the mandate of heaven, a divine right bestowed from the sky. In the Hebrew tradition, kings were anointed by prophets, but their authority was said to flow directly from God, who dwelt in the heavens. In Japan, emperors traced their bloodline to Amaterasu, the sun goddess. Even the Incas of the Andes claimed descent from the sun. Civilizations separated by oceans and millennia, yet united by one refrain. True authority falls from above. Could these be distant cultural memories of a single primordial event, the moment when kingship descended? An encounter not mythological but historical, later encoded as theology once the witnesses were dust. The prism's language suggests it. It does not describe kingship as a metaphor. It treats it as cargo. The kingship descended. The kingship was in Eridu. The syntax implies movement of an object, not of an idea. In this light, the first kings weren't self-made warlords. They were appointees, administrators of a system installed by powers that viewed Earth as territory to be organized, not conquered. The human world didn't invent hierarchy. It inherited it. Government was not the child of necessity, but the residue of contact. Civilization's operating system was preloaded. This changes even the way we interpret religion itself. If the gods were once physical, present, visible, beings whose visits inspired temples rather than faith, then theology is simply the long echo of memory. The rituals that came after are attempts to re-establish the connection once it was lost. When Enki, the great engineer of heaven, vanished from Eridu, his temples became microphones aimed at silence. It is unsettling to think of ourselves not as the architects of our world, but as its maintenance crew, keeping alive a structure we barely understand, designed long ago by someone else. Yet that is precisely what the king list implies. It describes civilization as a continuation, not an origin. Humanity inherited cities, laws, astronomy, and mathematics that appear in the archaeological record too abruptly to be evolutionary. The leap from mud huts to written law in Mesopotamia happens in a blink, as if the blueprint was delivered, not discovered. And if that is true, then what we call progress is merely recovery. Each technological revolution might be the rediscovery of something that once was commonplace in a forgotten era. Perhaps our own obsession with reaching the heavens, launching satellites, building towers, searching the stars, is not aspiration, but nostalgia. The Sumerians would not have found that idea strange. To them, the descent of kingship was not a one-time event. It was a pattern, a cosmic rhythm. Authority came from above, fell to earth, decayed, and returned, like rain. The prism records only the first cycle, the one before the flood. What came later were its echoes. So when you read that haunting phrase, "After the kingship descended from heaven," try to hear it the way the Sumerian scribe did, not as myth, not as metaphor, but as logistics. Something arrived. Something installed order on chaos. And once its task was complete, or its experiment compromised, it withdrew. The flood would wash the slate clean, but the blueprint remained, buried in clay, waiting for the next civilization to remember how to read. In the south of modern Iraq, where the dry riverbeds of ancient Mesopotamia braid through desert, lies a low mound of ruins called Tel Abu Sharain. To the untrained eye, it's nothing, just broken mud brick, brittle shards, the ghost of something once immense. Yet beneath those layers of dust rests what many archaeologists believe to be the world's first city, Eridu. To the Sumerians, it was the home of the gods, and to the scribe of the king list, it was the place where kingship first descended from heaven. Eridu's story begins in silence, in water. The city was built at the edge of the Persian Gulf thousands of years before recorded time, where fresh water met salt, a liminal zone between worlds. The Sumerians called this underworld ocean Abzu, and believed it was the domain of Enki, the god of creation, knowledge, and craft. Archaeologists have traced the evolution of Eridu's temple to Enki through at least 17 rebuilding phases, stacked layer upon layer on the same sacred spot. Each generation tore down the old and rebuilt it larger, higher, as if trying to reach something they feared losing. Deepest of all lies a small single-room shrine from around 5400 BC. A room lined with fish bones and river mud, a primitive altar where something began. Scholars interpret this as the earliest temple ever built by human hands. But the question remains, why here, and why so suddenly? The earliest Eridu appears not as a gradual settlement, but as a leap, an organized city emerging fully formed, complete with a central temple, canals, and ritual architecture. Civilization, it seems, flickered on like a switch. If kingship truly descended anywhere, this would have been the landing site. The first ruler listed, Alulim of Eridu, is said to have reigned for 28,800 years. His successor, Alulgar, for 36,000. Numbers that defy mortality. But within Sumerian cosmology, they are perfect. 8 sars and 10 sars, cycles of 3,600 years, neat as gears in a clock. Each reign aligns with celestial arithmetic, suggesting these were not lifespans, but epochs, regimes of cosmic order overseen by beings whose sense of time far exceeded our own. To the ancients, longevity was not metaphorical. It was evidence of divinity. The longer a king ruled, the closer he was to the eternal rhythm of the heavens. Thus, Alulim and Alulgar were not kings as we understand them, but custodians, keepers of a pattern that linked the earth to the sky. In mythic fragments, Alulim is described as the shepherd of Eridu, the one who brought law from the water. If the king list preserves a dim recollection of something real, then Alulim may represent the first governor of a world newly ordered, an emissary sent to turn chaos into culture. Enki's presence in Eridu deepens the mystery. He is called Ea in later Akkadian texts, the house of water, yet his role extends far beyond myth. He is depicted surrounded by streams of flowing water, often with strange devices, rods, measuring lines, tablets, tools of architecture and mathematics. In stories, he imparts the me, divine decrees or data modules that encode every element of civilization: music, weaving, writing, justice, kingship itself. The Mi were stored in his temple, the Abzu, in Eridu, the supposed origin point of human knowledge. When seen through modern eyes, the Mi sound eerily technological, as if the god's wisdom came in the form of information, not revelation. To the Sumerians, Enki was not a distant deity. He was an engineer, a geneticist, a teacher. He shaped humanity from clay, mixing divine essence with earthly substance. Clay, the very medium used to inscribe their tablets, was, symbolically, the interface between man and God. Every record, every tablet, was a small reenactment of creation. When the scribe pressed his stylus into wet clay, he was repeating Enki's act, giving shape to formless dust. Eridu, therefore, wasn't just the first city. It was a prototype, a test site where divine and human met in partnership. Its layout followed sacred geometry, aligned with stars, its ziggurat temple built to echo the tiered structure of the cosmos, heaven, earth, and underworld. Within its precincts, kings like Alulim and Alalgar ruled not by force, but by directive, managing an early civilization that already understood irrigation, calendar cycles, and metallurgy far beyond what archaeology can comfortably explain. Consider the archaeological anomaly. Artifacts from Eridu, as early as strata, show sophisticated ceramics and trade items from distant regions, though no gradual cultural buildup exists nearby. The site emerges complete, as though imported. The historian Samuel Noah Kramer once wrote that civilization appears first in Mesopotamia as a tree planted full-grown. A tree from nowhere. If Eridu was indeed the first node in a network of celestial governance, that phrase may be less poetic than literal. Then, as mysteriously as it rose, Eridu's prominence fades. The king list tells us, after kingship was lowered to Eridu, it was taken to Bad Tibira. The capital moved. The torch passed. Eridu became a memory, a holy site, not a center of power. Why? Perhaps the mission changed. Perhaps the project succeeded. Or perhaps the connection that once linked heaven and earth began to decay. When the archaeologists brush sand from the top of Eridu's oldest altar, they expose not just the first temple, but the foundation of our species' amnesia. Every layer built on the last, striving to hold on to something slipping away, a physical metaphor for memory itself. You can almost imagine the priests rebuilding again and again, each generation more desperate to preserve a relationship with absent gods. By the final rebuilds, the temple had grown monumental, yet hollow, like a megaphone calling into silence. Today, Eridu is quiet again. The marshes have receded. The ziggurat stands in ruin, its base swallowed by sand. But when the wind passes through the hollow bricks, it produces a low moan, as if the city itself still remembers the voices that once governed it. The king list begins there because, in a way, all order began there. The first spark of administration, of hierarchy, of civilization. If kingship was truly a descending force, then Eridu was the point of impact. And so, when we read, after the kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu, we might imagine not just a myth being born, but an installation complete, like the first program running on a new world. A civilization booted, then rebooted, each cycle leaving its imprint in clay. And beneath all those layers of temple and dust, perhaps still humming beneath our feet, the old foundation stone of humanity's first command: rule in accordance with the heavens. When the last fire of Eridu dimmed and kingship was taken up and carried to Bad Tibira, the story shifted from water to flame. If Eridu had been the cradle of knowledge, then Bad Tibira was the forge of transformation, a place where the gift of civilization became something tangible, molten, and perilous. Its name in Sumerian means fortress of the metal workers. In that translation lies the entire theme of the next age, the mastery of matter and the awakening of ambition. Archaeologists have never found the full ruins of Bad Tibira. They have found only hints, slag from smelters, traces of copper and tin, the residue of metallurgical art far beyond what the textbook timeline allows. Yet the king list speaks confidently. Here ruled the next sequence of antediluvian kings, Enmenluana, Enmengalana, and Dumuzi, the shepherd. Together they reigned for nearly 108,000 years. What kind of kingdom endures that long? In Sumerian cosmology, the leap from Eridu to Bad Tibira was symbolic of a cosmic migration, from the watery realm of Enki to the fiery domain of his counterpart, Enlil. The priests would have said that heaven had moved its throne, that the gods were now teaching mankind not how to dream, but how to build. Fire replaced water, metallurgy replaced ritual. The very elements changed allegiance. Under Enmenluana, whose reign lasted 12 sars, 43,200 years, the city entered what myths describe as the Age of the Forge. The Sumerian word for metal, Eridu, also meant shining. To work with it was to imitate the gods, to transform the dull flesh of the earth into immortal brilliance. The act of smelting was half industry, half sacrament. The smoke that rose from the furnaces was not pollution, it was prayer. Then came Enmengalana, who ruled for 8 sars, 28,800 years, and is remembered as the custodian of the Mi, the divine decrees or formulas of civilization. The texts describe him as a guardian of law, music, weaving, writing, and truth itself. Some scholars imagine the Mi as commandments carved on tablets, others whisper of crystalline data, luminous stones that contained instruction sets for society. Whatever they were, the Sumerians saw them as physical manifestations of knowledge, files of the gods, entrusted to a king-priest who understood the syntax of heaven. It was during this long metallurgical era that humanity first looked at the raw materials of the planet and saw possibility instead of limitation. The kiln, the anvil, the hammer, these became symbols of power. The king list records no wars, no rebellions, no human names at all, only reigns measured in the slow pulse of the cosmos. That silence suggests stability or control. Perhaps the rulers of Bad Tibira did not govern by armies, but by technology. Perhaps the secret of the forge was enough to keep the world obedient. Yet fire is a dangerous teacher. Every myth warns that those who master it risk being consumed. The Greeks would later call this the Promethean curse. The Sumerians expressed it through the tragedy of Dumuzi, the final king of Bad Tibira. His reign, a perfect 10 sars, 36,000 years, ends not with triumph, but with lament. Dumuzi is remembered as the shepherd, the beloved of the goddess Inanna, who descended into the underworld and left him to take her place. Dragged down by demons, Dumuzi dies. The land withers, the people wail. Each year, when the dry season came, the Sumerians reenacted his mourning, awaiting his return with the rains. What began as metallurgy became mythology. Dumuzi's death and resurrection were retold across continents, as Osiris in Egypt, as Tammuz in Babylon, as Adonis in Greece, as Mithras in Rome, even as the Christ in later centuries. The pattern, death, descent, rebirth, was forged in Bad Tibira's fires long before it was written in scripture. The king who ruled for millennia became the prototype for every dying and rising god to follow. Look closely at the symbolism: metal, fire, sacrifice, renewal. The same themes echo in the process of smelting itself. Ore must die in the furnace before it is reborn as something purer. Dumuzi's fall is the allegory of metallurgy made flesh. The gods were teaching a principle that transcended craft, that creation requires destruction, that perfection demands heat. But perhaps there is a darker layer. If the Anunnaki theory holds any truth, Bad Tibira might have been more than a city. It might have been an industrial colony. Zechariah Sitchin would later speculate that the metal workers were mining gold, the substance their celestial home required to sustain its atmosphere. In that interpretation, Enmenluana and Enmengalana were not kings but site directors. Dumuzi, the overseer whose personal story encoded the trauma of a failed operation. His death marked not mythic betrayal, but the end of a phase of extraction. When the resource was depleted or the mission complete, kingship, like a project archive, was moved again. Even stripped of extraterrestrial speculation, the pattern remains. The focus of civilization shifts from spiritual communion to technological control. Humanity learns to shape the world and begins to lose innocence in the process. The forge teaches mastery, but it also teaches hierarchy. Someone commands the fire, and someone feeds it. The birth of metallurgy is the birth of labor, of classes, of dependence on systems larger than individuals. Kingship, once a divine appointment, becomes a job with quotas. In the end, Bad Tibira's furnaces went cold. The king list tells us simply, then Bad Tibira was defeated. Its kingship was carried to Larak. No details, no cause. Just transition, like a curtain falling between acts. Perhaps the forges consumed too much, or the gods demanded balance. The world had been tempered. Now it needed order. And so, as the smoke thinned over the ruined city of fire, kingship lifted once more, gliding across the plains toward a new capital. Behind it, in the ash of Bad Tibira, lay the first lesson of civilization. That knowledge without restraint burns brighter than it should, and every forge, no matter how divine, eventually cools into dust. When the glow of Bad Tibira faded, kingship was said to rise and move once more. This time to Larak, a city scarcely remembered even in the ancient world. Its name survives only on a handful of tablets, half legible beneath centuries of damage. But what little remains paints an image of balance restored. If Eridu had embodied water and Bad Tibira fire, then Larak represented air, clarity, breath, the invisible law that holds everything in place. It was the realm of Ensipat-Zid-Ana, the priest-king who ruled for 13 Sars, 46,800 years. He is described not as a conqueror but as a stabilizer, the one who walked in perfect truth before the gods. Under him, the chaos of the forge gave way to harmony. Fields returned to order, calendars to predictability, and the heavens to mathematics. The texts associate him with Ninurta, the god of agriculture, boundaries, and discipline. The plough and the sword were both his tools. If Bad Tibira had taught humanity to transform matter, then Larak taught them to measure it. It is here that the Sumerian worldview begins to reveal itself not as primitive mythology, but as a coherent cosmology. Each antediluvian city embodies a principle of civilization. Eridu, creation; Bad Tibira, transformation; Larak, regulation. The progression feels deliberate, like the steps of an experiment, each phase building on the last. The king list doesn't explain this logic outright, but the order of succession reads like instructions written for posterity. In Larak, the temple of Ninurta was likely a hybrid of observatory and archive. The Sumerians saw the sky as a living text. Every star, every planet, every eclipse was part of an ongoing communication between heaven and earth. The priests were astronomers long before they were theologians. By tracking celestial motions, they learned to predict floods, harvests, and omens. Time itself became measurable, cyclical, reliable. Imagine standing on the plains of ancient Mesopotamia in the cool hours before dawn. The horizon glows faintly red as the first star of morning, Venus, rises above the river. A priest in a linen robe lifts his staff and marks its position against a row of clay markers, aligned perfectly east to west. He murmurs numbers, counts intervals, then inscribes them into wet clay. To him, this isn't superstition, it's communication. The heavens are speaking in geometry. The idea that the gods had once descended no longer required direct visitation. Their voices could now be traced in the pattern of the cosmos. This was the birth of astronomy, of order imposed upon the infinite. Humanity had learned not just to obey the gods, but to read them. Under Ensipat-Zid-Ana, that reading became law. The texts describe him as, he who measures the stars and arranges the fields. The same geometry that governed the heavens began to govern the land. Cities were designed on grids reflecting the constellations. Irrigation canals mirrored celestial rivers. What was above was below. This mirroring principle, later called as above, so below, originated here, long before Hermeticism gave it a name. Yet perfection breeds fragility. The more precise the system, the more catastrophic its collapse. Perhaps that is why the king list tells us without elaboration that after 46,800 years, Larak fell silent. Kingship, restless as ever, was carried to Sippar. Sippar, the city of the sun, was the fourth antediluvian capital. Its ruler, Enmendur-Ana, reigned for 21 sars, 75,600 years. His name translates roughly to the one who connects heaven and earth. Unlike his predecessors, his legend is preserved not only in the king list, but in other texts, where he appears as a sage lifted bodily into the heavens to learn the secrets of the gods. The parallels are uncanny. In later Hebrew tradition, a righteous man named Enoch is taken up by God, shown the workings of the cosmos, and returns transfigured. Both figures, Enmendur-Ana and Enoch, are taught to read the divine tablets of destiny. Both measure the movement of the sun and moon. Both are said to teach humanity the art of divination and timekeeping. The resemblance is so precise that some scholars have suggested they are echoes of the same archetype, a single prehistoric figure remembered under different tongues. The city of Sippar was devoted to Utu, the solar deity, the all-seeing eye of truth. It was said his light judged both gods and men. The priests of Sippar constructed their temples in perfect alignment with the solar solstices, making the city itself a clock of stone and shadow. They studied the sun not as an object of worship, but as a manifestation of law. Light became justice. Motion became morality. To rule under such a symbol was to embody transparency. Enmendur-Ana's reign, according to myth, was a time when there were no lies. The sun exposed everything. Yet the legend also warns that such enlightenment cannot last. In the epic fragments, Enmendur-Ana ascends to heaven to learn divine secrets, but he cannot remain. He must return to earth and rule as mortal once more. The message is subtle. Knowledge is a gift and a burden. The one who sees too much is exiled by the very light he sought. In Sippar, the Sumerian experiment reached its zenith. Humanity could now build, measure, and predict. The descent of kingship was complete. It had transferred not only authority, but understanding. The heavens no longer needed to send their emissaries. Their laws were written into the human mind. But knowledge, once received, cannot be controlled. The same precision that governed the stars would soon reveal the instability of the world below. The patterns of the heavens hinted at cycles, great ones, of renewal and destruction. The priests of Sippar, watching the sun's slow drift against the background of stars, may have noticed something dreadful. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow tilt of the cosmic clock that foretold an ending. Perhaps they saw the signs of the coming flood long before it arrived. Perhaps Enmendur-Ana's ascent to heaven was not invitation, but evacuation. When the king list says, "Then the flood swept over," it may be recording not divine punishment, but the inevitable culmination of a cosmic rhythm. And so, as the sun set over Sippar for the last time, kingship prepared to move again. To Shuruppak, the city of warning, the final stronghold before the deluge. Civilization had learned everything it could. The heavens had spoken, humanity had listened. Now, the test would begin. By the time kingship reached Shuruppak, the world had grown old. The rivers carried the silt of millennia. Temples had been rebuilt and forgotten more times than anyone could remember. And yet the order installed from heaven still pulsed faintly through the plains of Sumer. Shuruppak, the healing city, lay on the banks of the Euphrates, where the world's first physicians practiced, where libraries of clay tablets whispered the secrets of the gods. It was here that the final pre-flood king, Ubaratutu, ruled for 18 sars, 64 to 800 years. His city was prosperous, learned, and perhaps already doomed. The king list names Ubaratutu in one sentence, then ends the age of the gods with 5 words that echo like thunder. Then the flood swept over. No explanation, no emotion, just an event so vast it required no embellishment. In that ellipsis lies the entire trauma of the human species. Archaeology confirms at least a trace of this story. At the ruins of Shuruppak, modern Tel Farah, archaeologists unearthed a layer of river-deposited silt, more than 2 meters thick, sandwiched between layers of habitation debris. It dates to roughly 2900 BC. The stratum is sterile, no pottery, no bones, no human trace. It speaks of a sudden inundation powerful enough to erase a civilization. And above it, a new layer of rebuilding, humbler, beginning again from zero. The evidence, mute and perfect, aligns uncannily with the myth. Yet the king list is not the only text to remember. Another tablet, the Epic of Atrahasis, tells the same story through human eyes. The gods, disturbed by mankind's noise, decide to destroy their creation. One deity, Enki, loyal friend to humankind, warns a man of Shuruppak, Utnapishtim, son of Ubaratutu. Tear down your house and build a boat, the voice says. Abandon possessions, save life. Utnapishtim obeys. When the flood comes, the gods themselves tremble before its violence. When the waters recede, a dove is sent forth. It returns with no rest. A raven, released after, finds land and does not return. Sound familiar? The Epic of Genesis, written millennia later, mirrors these same details. Different names, same geometry of survival. Perhaps the flood was not punishment but protocol, a scheduled reset embedded in the rhythms the priests of Sippar once observed. Ancient astronomers recorded the cycles of the heavens, and some patterns return every 12,000 years. Climatic upheaval, shifting poles, cometary debris. The myth of a deluge may preserve the memory of one such cataclysm. In this reading, the gods did not send the flood. They merely knew it was coming. And kingship, that fragile bridge between heaven and earth, could not prevent it. Picture the last days of Shuruppak. The sky darkens for weeks. Rain falls with metallic taste. The rivers swell beyond their banks, and the ziggurats, the proud stairways to heaven, become islands in a rising inland sea. Priests gather at the temple of Ubaratutu, reciting hymns to Enki, asking for instruction. None comes. The divine order that once descended to Eridu remains silent. For the first time in 241 to 200 years, heaven does not answer. Somewhere in that silence, Utnapishtim begins building. His neighbors mock him. His tools ring out like bells of warning. He loads the boat with animals, seeds, and scrolls, perhaps copies of the Me, the encoded knowledge of the gods. When the rains begin, he seals the door with pitch. The flood rises. The king list ends. For 7 days and nights, according to the epic, the world drowns. Cities vanish beneath mud, temples crumble, and even the gods, safe in their celestial realms, cover their faces and weep. Their lips were pressed together like wall plaster, one line reads. The flood is not judgment, it is terror without malice. Then silence. The boat drifts among mountaintops. The survivors, if any, disembark into a world scrubbed clean. Utnapishtim offers sacrifice. The smoke pleases the gods. In gratitude, or perhaps guilt, they grant him immortality and exile him to live at the mouth of the rivers, beyond mortal reach. From there, he will one day speak to Gilgamesh, the king who seeks to reclaim the lost secret of eternal life. In this moment, mythology and geology touch. A civilization ends, another begins. The reigns of the 8 kings vanish beneath the flood, and when the waters withdraw, time itself restarts. The king list continues with new rulers whose lifespans shrink from millennia to centuries, then decades. The divine blood thins, the world becomes ours. But remnants of the old world linger. In the oldest post-flood myths, The gods convene and decree that human life shall be short, and knowledge shall be fragmented. Never again, they say, shall man approach the heavens. What we call progress, then, may be the slow undoing of that command, a rebellion against the forgetfulness imposed upon us. When you stand on the plain of Shuruppak today, it is hard to imagine such a cataclysm. The land is dry, cracked, silent. But beneath the soil lies that sterile layer of silt, the frozen pulse of a world erased. The flood swept over, yes, but it also sealed the memory of the gods like a fossil inside the earth. Every temple, every city that rose afterward would build upon that bed of mud, unknowingly standing on the grave of the divine age. And so ends the first version of civilization, not with war or decadence, but with water, nature's great reset. The 8 kings are gone. The gods retreat to the sky. The clay dries. Humanity begins again, stripped of memory but carrying an echo, an unexplainable longing for the heavens, and a recurring dream of a world once perfect, now drowned. When the floodwaters finally sank into the soil, the world was unrecognizable. Rivers had changed their beds, mountains were shaved smooth, the very sky seemed different. The survivors, few and scattered, stepped out into silence. No birdsong, no temples, no kings. The age of the gods had ended, and in its place began the fragile experiment of mankind alone. The king list marks this transition with deliberate coldness. After the flood had swept over, the kingship descended from heaven once more. The kingship was in Kish. Kish, the first city of the post-Diluvian world, was small compared to Eridu or Bad Tibira, yet its importance was cosmic. It was here that human kingship, severed from its divine source, was reinstalled. The names that follow on the prism, Jushur, Kulasina Bel Etana, belong not to beings of impossible age, but to men, rulers who reigned for hundreds, then mere decades. The descent of heaven into matter was complete. The divine clock had reset to mortal time. And yet, something of the old order remained. The myths of this new age are haunted by memory, echoes of immortality, longing for lost perfection. Among these new rulers, one figure towers above all others, Gilgamesh, 5th king of Uruk, 2/3 god and 1/3 man. His story bridges the gap between myth and history, between the impossible kings of the antediluvian world and the verifiable world of archaeology. We know Gilgamesh existed, not merely as a legend, but as a flesh and blood monarch. Excavations at Uruk revealed inscriptions bearing his name, and the walls of the city he built still stand beneath the sands of Iraq. Yet his legend, recorded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, reads like the final echo of the Sumerian age of gods. It begins in arrogance and ends in revelation, as if the human race itself were learning what it meant to be mortal. The tale unfolds as tragedy. Gilgamesh, unmatched in strength, builds mighty Uruk and rules with divine confidence. The gods, seeing his pride, create Enkidu, a wild man from the steppe, to challenge him. Their battle becomes friendship. Together they slay the monster Humbaba, kill the bull of heaven, and defy the cosmic order. But when Enkidu dies as punishment, Gilgamesh's invincible heart breaks. For the first time in history, a man stands before the mystery of death and cannot bear it. He embarks on a journey to the edge of the world to find Utnapishtim, the immortal survivor of the flood, the same man whose father, Ubaratutu, was the last king before the deluge. Gilgamesh seeks not power, but understanding. How can I escape what awaits all men? The question burns through the ages like a torch handed from one civilization to the next. After crossing seas of death and mountains of flame, Gilgamesh finds the old man in a distant paradise. Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood, how the gods once granted him eternal life as a reward for preserving the seed of creation. But that gift, he says, was given once and will not be given again. Immortality is no longer part of the human design. The life you seek, he tells the king, you will never find. When the gods created man, they allotted to him death, but life they retained in their own hands. Even so, Utnapishtim offers him one last chance, a secret plant that restores youth. Gilgamesh finds it at the bottom of the sea. For a moment it seems the bridge between heaven and earth might reopen. But as he bathes, a serpent steals the plant, shedding its skin as it slithers away. A cruel reminder that renewal belongs to nature, not man. The hero returns to Uruk, defeated, yet transformed. Standing before his city's towering walls, he realizes that the true immortality lies not in endless years, but in what endures beyond them: wisdom, art, memory. The story closes not with despair, but acceptance. In that quiet resignation lies the birth of the human condition, finite, yet conscious of eternity. For the Sumerians, Gilgamesh's quest was more than myth. It was a record of transition, from a race ruled by gods to a species ruled by itself. He is both the last of the demigods and the first true man, carrying within him the diluted blood of the Anunnaki and the restless curiosity of humankind. The king list writes his name without comment, as if to say, the experiment continues. Yet, there's a paradox at the heart of his legend. If the post-flood kings were entirely human, how could Gilgamesh be part divine? The scribes themselves offer no answer. They record his reign in the same tone used for Alulim or Dumuzi, implying continuity rather than rupture. It is as if the divine lineage had not vanished completely, but had simply receded into myth, dormant in the bloodlines of kings, echoing faintly in human DNA. Across cultures, similar stories arise. Demigods born of unions between heaven and earth, heroes who walk among mortals yet dream of the stars. In Egypt, the pharaoh is the son of Ra. In Greece, Heracles is born of Zeus. In India, Manu survives the flood to repopulate the world. Every civilization, it seems, preserves a dim recollection of a time when the boundary between divine and human was porous. And always there is the flood, the dividing line, the memory that refuses to fade. Even as science and skepticism reshaped our world, the archetype persists. Perhaps it is not myth at all, but genetic memory, an ancestral echo of the cataclysm that nearly erased us, and the gods, or beings, we once served. In the quiet that follows the flood, the narrative of humanity begins to repeat itself. Cities rise, power consolidates, ambition rekindles. The Sumerian king list becomes a template for history itself, a pattern of ascent, hubris, and collapse. Each civilization believes itself unique, but all trace their architecture, laws, and hierarchies back to the same design first installed in Eridu. The operating system of kingship, once downloaded from the heavens, continues to run. The prism story is not simply about the past, it's about recurrence. The gods may have departed, but the blueprint they left behind ensures that history will echo them, over and over, until we remember what we were meant to learn. The prism ends, but the questions only begin. What, truly, is this text? The Sumerian king list refuses to behave like myth, yet it refuses to sit quietly as history. It lists real places, Eridu, Tibira, Sippar, and real kings like Gilgamesh. It also claims reigns of 43,000 years. The style is not poetic. It reads like a bureaucratic record, a ledger carved in clay. The tone is dry, factual, accounting-like, a clerk's hand documenting eternity. The tension between what is written and what is possible forms one of the greatest enigmas in archaeology. 3 explanations attempt to solve it. The first is the mainstream view that the king list is royal propaganda. Compiled around 2100 BC, during the reign of a Sumerian ruler in Isin, it may have been designed to legitimize his rule by creating an unbroken chain of kingship, stretching back to the gods. The fantastical reigns before the flood were symbolic, representing divine perfection. The flood itself was a convenient line dividing the mythic age from the historical. In this view, the document is not false. It is theological politics, a cosmic genealogy meant to sanctify power. The list's long reigns are not numbers, but metaphors of legitimacy. It's a satisfying explanation. It keeps the world familiar. But it also falters under its own neatness. Why the meticulous arithmetic? Why the base 60 pattern, the exact multiples of SAR, 3,600 years per unit? Why does the text list the same later kings whose existence is archaeologically confirmed, yet make no stylistic distinction between them and the ones who supposedly reigned for millennia? A propagandist might exaggerate, but would he encode his lies in perfect mathematical symmetry? The second interpretation is more cautious, the chronological misreading theory. Perhaps the king's reigns are not lifespans at all, but dynastic durations. Alulim might represent not one man, but a lineage, a house, or even a city's era of dominance. Or perhaps the numbers were written in an unknown unit, months instead of years, or symbolic cycles rather than literal time. If we divide by 60, or by the Sumerian year of 360 days, the numbers shrink to plausible reigns. But doing so breaks the internal logic of the text. Its precision dissolves, and so the theory bends, then breaks. Then there is the third, and most dangerous possibility, the one whispered on late-night forums and ancient tablets alike, the Anunnaki hypothesis. This theory dares to read the king list literally, as a record of real rulers who were not entirely human. In the 1970s, an independent scholar named Zecharia Sitchin proposed that the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, were extraterrestrial beings from a wandering planet he called Nibiru. According to his interpretation, the Sumerians' mysterious unit of time, the SAR, corresponded to one Nibiruan year, the time it took their planet to complete a single elongated orbit around the sun, roughly 3,600 Earth years. When the king list states that Alulim reigned for 8 SARs, it means 8 Nibiruan years, or roughly 28,800 Earth years. The reigns, then, are not impossible. They are calibrated to a different calendar. In Sitchin's cosmic archaeology, the story unfolds like a science fiction epic written on clay. The Anunnaki, facing the depletion of their planet's atmosphere, traveled to Earth around 450,000 years ago to mine gold, which they needed for their survival. They established their first base at Eridu, the same city where kingship first descended from heaven. Over time, they engineered humans as laborers, mixing their own DNA with that of early hominids to create Adamu, the first man. Under this reading, the descent of kingship was no metaphor. It was administration. The 8 antediluvian kings were the governors of this planetary colony. Each reign marked a rotation of command, lasting several Nibiruan years. Their long lives were natural to their species, whose biology or technology extended far beyond human limits. The flood was not divine punishment, but collateral damage from a celestial catastrophe, perhaps the gravitational havoc caused by Nibiru's recurring passage through the inner solar system. To mainstream historians, this theory is heresy. There is no physical evidence of Nibiru, no alien artifacts in Sumerian ruins. Yet the allure of Sitchin's idea lies not in its proof, but in its symmetry. It makes sense of everything: the base 60 math, the sudden rise of civilization, the obsession with the stars, the recurring language of descent. It connects myth with mechanism, and if not true, it is at least useful. It forces us to reconsider the king list, not as a list of fantasies, but as a data set, compressed, coded, waiting for the right key. Beyond Sitchin, other scholars propose subtler versions of the same pattern. Some suggest the descent of kingship refers to the appearance of organized consciousness itself, a metaphor for the implantation of hierarchical order into early human minds. Civilization, in this sense, was installed, not invented. The kings were the archetypes of leadership, the template of governance seeded into collective memory. Whether that seed came from gods, aliens, or our own unconscious, the effect was the same. Humanity awoke to structure. Perhaps that is the king list's true message. The flood was the reboot, the great purge of memory. Kingship was the reinstall, the moment the program of civilization began again on clean ground. Every empire since has been a version update, running the same code under new names. There remains a final, haunting clue. The term the Sumerians used for kingship descended from heaven is not given or bestowed. The verb literally means to come down, as if something physical, tangible, descended. A pillar of light, a craft, or simply a revelation? The text never says. It just insists that this descent was real, and that everything that followed, cities, laws, science, language, was born from it. Perhaps we will never know which version of the king list is true, but its persistence across millennia, carved and recopied through floods, wars, and empires, suggests it preserves something more than propaganda. It is an encrypted memory, an ancestral whisper from a world that refuses to be forgotten. And if that whisper feels familiar, perhaps it is because it speaks from within us. The kings who once ruled for 241,200 years may not have vanished. They may have become our own instincts, the drive to build, to measure, to rule. Civilization, after all, still moves as if remembering a command it cannot disobey. If the Sumerian king list is an ancient record of rulers who lived for hundreds of millennia, then its closing words are more than an ending. They are a mirror held up to our own civilization. Then the flood swept over, a sentence that erases a world, yet preserves its echo in clay. The 8 kings vanish beneath the waters, but their pattern endures. Hierarchy, dominion, progress, collapse. Perhaps they are not gone at all. Perhaps we are living inside the ghost of their design. Every civilization that came after Sumer, Egypt, Babylon, Rome, China, built upon the same blueprint. Each crowned rulers as intermediaries between heaven and earth. Each spoke of a divine right, a cosmic mandate, a lineage that began not with humanity, but with the stars. The pharaohs of Egypt called themselves the sons of Ra. The emperors of Japan traced descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu. The kings of Europe called their blood blue, the color of divinity. The echo of the Anunnaki resounds everywhere, disguised as theology, as monarchy, as genetics. Some researchers have gone further. They point to the anomaly of Rh-negative blood, a rare trait found in only 15% of the population. Unlike all other humans, Rh-negative mothers can reject their own unborn children if the father is Rh-positive. It is a mystery in biology, an incompatibility that should not exist within a single species. The highest concentration of this blood type is found among the Basque people of Spain and France, whose language has no known relatives. Coincidence or genetic residue? To those who see humanity as a hybrid creation, the answer is unsettlingly clear. The blood of the gods still flows, diluted but present. Whether one accepts such ideas or not, they reveal something profound. The king list has transformed from artifact to mirror. It reflects the human obsession with origins, power, and identity. Why do we instinctively build pyramids and towers? Why do we enthrone leaders, invent pantheons, seek heaven in the stars? The clay prism does not answer. It simply whispers that we are reenacting a memory too old to name. In this sense, the Anunnaki need not be physical beings at all. They could represent archetypes, the personified principles that descended into the human psyche when consciousness itself was born. Each king could symbolize a stage in that awakening. Alulim, the spark of reason. Alalgar, the order of governance. Enmenlu-Ana, the mastery of matter. Dumuzi, the awakening of love and sacrifice. The flood, then, would be the shattering of innocence, the birth of awareness that all things die. Kingship descended from heaven not as a spacecraft, but as the architecture of the mind. But if we are the inheritors of that architecture, we are also its prisoners. The same hierarchical instinct that built Eridu built empires and corporations. The same divine hunger that reached for the heavens now fuels machines and algorithms. Humanity, the child of both clay and starlight, is still seeking its makers, through religion, through science, through stories like this one. Consider what the prism might mean if read not as history, but as prophecy. The first kings ruled for 240,200 years before the flood. The pattern of decline is geometric. Lifespans divide, civilizations shrink, memory fades. If history is cyclical, are we not approaching the same precipice? Our own age, too, is a time of fire and metal, of endless creation balanced on the edge of destruction. The planet warms, the seas rise, and the language of myth begins to sound like forecast. Then the flood swept over. Could those words be waiting to write themselves again? And yet, amid the dread, there is awe. Because even if the king list is myth, it is a myth written with impossible precision, mathematics woven into metaphor, astronomy carved into faith. It suggests that our ancestors, or their teachers, understood time and order on a scale we are only beginning to rediscover. The very system of counting we still use for hours and circles, 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 360 degrees, comes from their base 60 cosmos. We live inside their mathematics. Every clock, every compass, every orbit is a faint continuation of Sumerian thought. The prism's closing challenge lingers. Are you certain you know the whole story? Maybe the true question isn't whether the kings of old were gods or aliens, but why their story feels so familiar. Why their reign, ancient beyond measure, seems to pulse in our collective memory. Why the myth of descent still governs our imagination. If we are, as some believe, a species with amnesia, then the Sumerian king list is our forgotten diary, a record of when we first opened our eyes and saw the stars not as lights, but as home. It reminds us that history might not be a straight line, but a spiral, returning endlessly to the same divine experiment. Intelligence emerging from dust, reaching upward, then drowning, then rising again. The prism sits now in the Ashmolean Museum, locked behind glass. Its wedge-shaped letters, so small, so precise, contain both the birth certificate and the epitaph of the first civilization. Tourists walk past it without noticing, but those who stop, those who read its quiet inscription, can almost feel the hum of something vast behind it, a memory of when gods ruled the earth, or when men first dreamed they did. Either way, the story ends the same. The flood swept over. And yet, we are still here, building, remembering, questioning. Perhaps that is the real legacy of the kings of Sumer. Their empire fell, their names faded, but the question they left behind remains immortal. Are we the descendants of men, or the distant children of the gods? Or are we, impossibly, both?